The Galactic Council chamber hung suspended in the void above Axis Prime like a jewel carved from starlight itself. Its walls were made of crystal so pure that they caught and reflected the glow of 1,000 distant suns. Inside this magnificent structure, chaos reigned. 47 different species had sent their representatives to this emergency session. The chamber echoed with sounds that no human ear had heard in 5 centuries. The chittering of insectoid delegates, the deep rumbling of silicon-based life forms, the electronic pulses of machine consciousness, and the melodic songs of beings who breathed methane instead of oxygen. But despite their differences, they all shared one thing in common. They were arguing with the fierce intensity of politicians who had long forgotten what true warfare actually meant. The galaxy had been at peace for 300 years. Oh, there were disputes, certainly. Border skirmishes, trade disagreements, the occasional threat of military action. But real war, the kind that burned worlds and scattered species to the cosmic winds, had become a distant memory. A thing of history books and ancient tales told to frighten younglings. Perhaps that was why they had grown so comfortable with their threats and ultimatums. At the central podium stood Ambassador Krell of the Vaxian Empire. He was an imposing figure, even by the standards of a chamber filled with diverse life forms. His exoskeleton gleamed like polished bronze under the chamber's lights. 6 fingers on each hand gripped the podium as he leaned forward, his compound eyes reflecting fragmented images of the assembled delegates. Myths, he bellowed, his voice translator rendering his words in dozens of languages simultaneously. Ancient superstitions and bedtime stories. You honestly expect the Vaxian Empire to halt our legitimate expansion into unclaimed territory because of phantom warriors and ghost ships? The chamber exploded into noise. The crystalline collective's delegates chimed their objections in harmonic frequencies. The representatives from the smaller border worlds raised their voices in fear and protest. Everyone seemed to be shouting at once. The Vaxians had been pushing their borders outward for months now. Slowly, methodically, they had been claiming systems that other species considered disputed territory. The crystalline collective had drawn their line in the stardust. No further expansion or there would be war. Between these two powerful forces lay dozens of colonies. Billions of innocent beings who had no desire to be caught in the crossfire of someone else's territorial dispute. And here, in this chamber that was supposed to prevent such conflicts, the representatives argued like children fighting over toys. In the very back of the chamber, in a seat that most delegates probably did not even notice, sat a being so old that her species had witnessed empires rise from nothing and crumble to dust. Archivist Mirsha was frail, her body bent with the weight of ages. Her skin had the texture of ancient parchment, and her eyes carried the depth of someone who had seen too much history unfold. She rose slowly to her feet. The chamber did not immediately notice. The arguments continued, voices rising and falling like waves on some distant shore. But gradually, like ripples spreading across a pond, the noise began to fade. Delegates noticed their neighbors falling silent. Those beings turned to see what had captured their attention. And so the quiet spread, until the entire massive chamber held its breath. When Archivist Mirsha spoke, even the proudest warriors leaned forward to listen. There was something about her voice, soft as wind through dead autumn leaves, yet carrying to every corner of the vast space. "I was young when they left," she said, and those simple words seemed to carry the weight of centuries. 500 years ago I was barely into my second lifetime. I remember them. I remember the humans. Ambassador Krell's mandibles clicked in what might have been contempt. With respect, Archivist, the humans are myths. Stories told to military cadets about the dangers of overreach. If they ever existed at all, they are long extinct. They were not myths, Mirsha replied, and despite the softness of her voice, there was steel beneath it. They were very, very real, Ambassador Krell. And their disappearance was not defeat. It was not extinction. It was choice. A murmur ran through the chamber. Some delegates exchanged glances. Others checked their personal data devices, calling up ancient historical files that most had dismissed as exaggerated legends. Then where are they? Krell demanded, spreading his arms wide in a gesture of mockery. If these legendary warriors were real, if they commanded such power that old teachers still frighten students with tales of human fleets, then why have we not seen even a single ship in 500 years? Why have they left no trace? Mirsha was quiet for a long moment. Her ancient eyes, which had witnessed the birth and death of civilizations, reflected something that might have been sadness. Or perhaps it was memory. Or fear. Because they knew what they had become, she finally said. They looked at themselves, at what their power was turning them into, and they were wise enough to fear it. Fear. Krell laughed, a harsh sound that his translator rendered as something between a bark and a screech. The legendary humans feared throughout the galaxy were afraid of themselves? That is either poetry or nonsense, archivist. It is truth, Mirsha said simply. They were warriors who had forgotten how to stop fighting. Conquerors who did not know how to build peace. They had technology that could crack planets and break stars. And they realized that such power, in hands that only knew how to clench into fists, would eventually destroy not just others but themselves. Before Krell could respond, the massive doors of the chamber burst open. A junior aide, his face pale with shock, rushed in. Such interruptions were almost unheard of during official council sessions. The aide's translator struggled to keep up with his rapid, panicked speech. Sirs, madams, delegates of all forms, he gasped. We are receiving urgent reports from the frontier colonies. Multiple systems are detecting massive gravitational anomalies. Energy signatures that do not match any known propulsion system in our databases. The readings they are impossible. The chamber fell into a different kind of silence now. Not the respectful quiet that had greeted Mirsha, but the frozen stillness of sudden fear. Explain, someone demanded. The aide fumbled with a portable display device. The contacts are appearing out of nowhere. Just materializing in normal space. They are emerging from faster-than-light travel, but using a method we cannot identify. Sensors are unable to get accurate counts, but the formation. His voice trembled. The formation spans 3 light hours. Whatever is coming, it is enormous. He activated the holographic display. Static-filled images appeared, transmitted from the mining colony of Helios 7. The colony sat at the very edge of disputed space, right in the path of the Vaxian advance. In the grainy footage, against the eternal darkness of space, something was taking shape. Ships. Dozens of them. Hundreds. They were sleek and angular, with lines that suggested both elegance and deadly purpose. Their hulls seemed to be made of something that drank in light rather than reflecting it. They moved with a grace that seemed almost organic, forming patterns that were clearly deliberate. The designs were utterly foreign to modern galactic architecture. But for those delegates old enough to remember or curious enough to study history, those shapes existed in one place, the ancient archives. In files that most species had long ago marked as historical curiosities. Files marked with a single ancient word that suddenly seemed to carry terrible weight. Terran. Ambassador Krell stared at the view screen. His compound eyes, which could process visual information far faster than most species, tried to make sense of what he was seeing. His mandibles opened and closed repeatedly, a sign of deep distress in his species. For the first time since the session had begun, he had nothing to say. Archivist Mirsha had not moved from her standing position. She watched the view screen with eyes that had seen this once before in her youth, when the humans had still walked among the stars. Her voice when she spoke was barely a whisper. But in the absolute silence of the chamber, everyone heard it. They have returned. The battle had been going on for 6 hours, and space around Helios 7 looked like a storm of fire and metal. Vaxian warships, each one as large as a small moon and covered with enough weapons to destroy a planet, exchanged devastating fire with the elegant crystalline vessels of the collective. The collective ships were beautiful, made of living crystal that grew and reformed itself, but they were losing ground against the brutal efficiency of Vaxian military doctrine. Between these two mighty fleets, caught like a small animal between two fighting predators, sat the mining colony of Helios 7. Its defensive shields flickered and sparked each time a stray shot came too close. The shield generators were never meant to withstand this kind of punishment. They were designed to protect against asteroids and solar radiation, not military-grade plasma cannons. On the surface of Helios 7, 3 million civilians pressed together in emergency shelters that had been carved deep into the moon's rocky crust. Humans would have called them people, but that word was too limiting for the diverse collection of beings huddled in the darkness. There were methane breathers in their special enclosures. Silicon-based life forms that communicated through vibrations. Families of insectoid workers who had come here for the generous mining wages. All of them, despite their vast differences, were doing the same thing. They were praying to gods across 100 different faiths that they would live to see another sunrise. High above them, in the command center of the Vaxian dreadnought Crimson Fong, Captain Tarek studied his tactical display with something that resembled satisfaction. His species did not smile the way humans did, but his mandibles clicked together in a pattern that expressed the same emotion. They were winning. The display showed the battlefield in 3 dimensions, with friendly forces marked in blue and enemy vessels in red. The red markers were retreating, slowly but surely being pushed back. Several collective ships had already been disabled, their beautiful crystalline hulls cracked and dark. The Vaxians had lost some fighters and taken damage to 2 frigates, but nothing serious. Nothing that would change the outcome. Another hour, Tarek calculated. Maybe less. The collective would recognize they were beaten and retreat with whatever ships they had left. Helios 7 and its valuable mineral deposits would belong to the Vaxian Empire. Another system added to their growing territory. Another step in their expansion across this region of space. Then every alarm on his ship started screaming at once. The sound was deafening. Red lights flashed across every surface. The tactical display erupted in warnings and alerts. Officers shouted over each other, trying to make sense of what their instruments were telling them. For a moment, Tarek thought they had been hit by some kind of surprise weapon. His ship shuddered and he gripped the armrests of his command chair. But they had not been hit. The ship was intact. The alarms were not damage warnings. They were detection alerts. Captain? His sensor officer was a young Vaxian named Dresh, normally calm and professional. Now his voice cracked with something that might have been panic. Multiple contacts emerging from faster-than-light travel. Bearing. He stopped, staring at his display as if it had personally betrayed him. Bearing everywhere. They are appearing all around us. They are surrounding the entire battle space. Tarek felt his combat-trained mind shift into emergency mode. Reinforcements? Had the collective called in their allies? But no, that made no sense. The collective had not had time to send for help, and besides, their fleet composition was all wrong for a planned ambush. Identification? He demanded, his voice sharp and clear despite the chaos around him. Who are they? Dresh's claws moved frantically across his control panel. The computer systems of the Crimson Fang were state-of-the-art, capable of identifying any known vessel type in the galaxy within seconds. But now those same systems seemed confused, running through their databases and finding nothing. Unknown, sir. The computer cannot match them to any known vessel class. The signatures do not match anything in our records. They are not collective ships. They are not any allied force we know. They are just appearing out of nowhere. On the main view screen, the image shifted from the tactical overview to a direct visual feed. What Tarek saw made his breath catch in his throat. Even a hardened warrior, someone who had fought in dozens of battles across his career, could recognize something unprecedented when he saw it. Ships were materializing out of the fabric of space itself. Not the usual flash and distortion of standard faster-than-light drives. These vessels seemed to slide into reality like knives cutting through a curtain. One moment there was empty space and the next moment there was a ship, as if it had always been there and the universe was just now remembering. They were beautiful in the way that predators are beautiful. Each ship looked like it had been carved from midnight itself, with hulls so dark they seemed to absorb the light of nearby stars. Smooth curves and sharp angles combined in designs that suggested both organic grace and deadly purpose. They moved with impossible precision, taking up positions around both fleets with mathematical accuracy. Tarek had been a military officer for 20 years. He had studied every major ship design in the known galaxy. He prided himself on being able to identify a vessel's origin, purpose, and capabilities at a glance. But these ships were like nothing he had ever seen or even imagined. "Get me a count," he ordered, forcing his voice to remain steady. A good captain did not show fear to his crew, no matter what he might be feeling inside. Dresh worked his controls and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. 312 ships, sir. All of them registering as larger than our dreadnoughts. They have taken up formation in a perfect sphere around the entire combat zone. 312. The number seemed impossible. That was more than half the size of the entire Vaxian fleet that had been assembled for this operation. And they had appeared in less than a minute, moving with such coordination that they had to be operating under a single unified command. The communications channels erupted with confused chatter. Vaxian captains demanding information. Collective commanders asking if this was some kind of Vaxian trick. Fighter pilots breaking formation as they tried to figure out what was happening. The ordered chaos of battle had transformed into genuine pandemonium. Nobody knew who these newcomers were. Nobody had ever seen technology like this. Ships this advanced should not exist in the current galaxy. Then, cutting through all the confusion and noise, a single transmission broadcast across every frequency. Every ship, Vaxian and collective alike, received it simultaneously. The message came in every known language of the galaxy, each translation perfect and clear, as if the speakers had native fluency in hundreds of different tongues. This is Admiral Miho of the Terran Expeditionary Fleet. The word seemed to freeze time itself. Terran. That word existed only in historical archives, in legends and old stories, in warnings told to young military cadets about the dangers of unchecked aggression. The voice continued, calm and utterly certain of itself. We have returned. All vessels will power down weapons immediately and withdraw to a safe distance from the colony. You have 2 minutes to comply. 2 minutes. Not a request. Not a negotiation. A simple statement of what would happen, delivered with the quiet confidence of someone who knew they would be obeyed. Captain Tarek stared at the view screen, where the dark ships maintained their perfect formation. His mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of stress and indecision. Around him, his bridge crew had fallen silent, waiting for his orders. 2 minutes to comply with demands from ships that should not exist, commanded by a species that was supposed to be extinct or mythical. 2 minutes to decide whether the legends had been warnings or promises. 2 minutes before the galaxy learned what happened when humans returned. The Galactic Council Chamber had witnessed many historic moments over its 3 centuries of existence. Treaties signed that ended wars. Declarations that changed the balance of power. Emergency sessions called during crises that threatened entire star systems. But never in all that time had it been this full. Every species in the known galaxy had sent their highest representatives. The usual seating arrangements were insufficient, so additional platforms had been hastily constructed in concentric circles around the central floor. The chamber, designed to accommodate perhaps 200 delegates comfortably, now held over 500 beings. They pressed together, wingtip to carapace, breathing apparatus to sensory organ, all trying to find space in a room that was never meant for such a crowd. Security forces from a dozen different worlds lined the walls, standing at careful attention. They carried their species' most advanced weapons and wore armor that could theoretically withstand plasma fire, kinetic strikes, and energy beams. But everyone in the chamber knew a simple truth that nobody wanted to say aloud. If the Terrans decided to be hostile, all the security in the galaxy would be as useful as tissue paper against a hurricane. The events at Helios 7 had shaken the foundations of galactic society. The Terran fleet had disabled both the Vaxian Armada and the collective forces without firing a single destructive shot. They had rendered thousands of warships completely helpless, then carefully towed them to safety and offered medical assistance to any injured crew members. It was a display of power so overwhelming, so absolute, that it had left military analysts speechless. You could defeat an enemy and make them fear you. You could destroy an enemy and make them hate you. But what the Terrans had done was somehow worse and better at the same time. They had demonstrated that they could do whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop them. And then they had chosen mercy. That choice was more terrifying than any weapon. Ambassador Krell stood at the Vaxian delegation's position, and if body language could kill, everyone in the chamber would already be dead. His exoskeleton seemed to have lost some of its luster. His compound eyes, usually bright and alert, looked dull. His mandibles clicked together in irregular patterns that spoke of barely controlled rage. His empire had been humiliated. The proud Vaxian military, undefeated in conventional warfare for over a century, had been rendered helpless like children having their toys taken away. Not destroyed. Not defeated in honest combat. Just turned off. Deactivated. Made irrelevant with technology that seemed like magic. And the worst part, the part that made Krell's blood burn hot with shame, was that the Terrans had been kind about it. They had apologized for the inconvenience. They had helped repair damaged ships. They had treated Vaxian warriors with respect and courtesy even while demonstrating how utterly outmatched those warriors were. It would have been easier if the humans had been cruel. Around the chamber, delegates whispered and murmured in hundreds of languages. Some expressed fear. Others wonder. A few, particularly those from smaller species who had always lived under the shadow of larger military powers, seemed almost hopeful. Perhaps these legendary humans would be different. Perhaps they would bring a new order to the galaxy. Or perhaps they would be just like every other powerful species in history, and the current order would simply be replaced with a new tyranny wearing a different face. The massive doors at the chamber's entrance opened with a deep, resonant sound that cut through all the whispered conversations. Every eye, sensor, and perceptual organ in the chamber turned toward that entrance. 2 humans walked in. The chamber fell absolutely silent. Not the respectful quiet of a formal occasion, but the stunned silence of witnesses to something they had never truly believed they would see. For 500 years, no one had seen a human in the flesh. Recordings existed, certainly. Ancient videos from before what the historians called the Great Silence. But those seemed like historical curiosities, no more real than images of extinct animals or vanished civilizations. These were real. The first human was tall, perhaps 2 meters in height, with a build that suggested both strength and efficiency. His hair was dark and cut very short, in a style that seemed military in nature. His eyes were brown, alert, and seemed to take in every detail of the chamber with a single sweeping glance. He wore a simple uniform of deep blue, marked only with a small emblem on his chest. The emblem showed a planet rising over the curve of a smaller world, Earth rising over Luna's horizon, though most in the chamber would not have recognized it. This was Admiral Miho. The second human was shorter but no less imposing. She moved with a grace that suggested someone who was completely comfortable in her own body, confident without being aggressive. Her hair was longer, pulled back in a traditional style that would have been familiar to her Korean ancestors from 1,000 years ago. Her eyes missed nothing, and there was something in her expression that combined steel and warmth in equal measure. This was Ambassador Hannah. They walked to the center of the chamber with quiet confidence. Not the strutting arrogance of conquerors. Not the hesitant steps of supplicants. Just the steady, certain movement of people who knew exactly who they were and what they had come to do. The delegates around them drew back slightly, creating a clear space. It was an unconscious reaction, the same instinct that made prey animals give space to predators. But the humans did not seem to notice or care. They simply walked to the designated speaking position at the chamber's center and stood there, waiting. Ambassador Hannah spoke first. Her voice was clear and strong, projected without shouting, as if she had trained for years to speak in large spaces. The chamber's translation systems rendered her words in hundreds of languages simultaneously, but many delegates would later swear that they had somehow understood her directly, as if her meaning transcended mere words. "Honorable members of the Galactic Council," she began, and there was something in her tone that made even the proudest species feel acknowledged and respected. "We are here to explain ourselves, to apologize, and to offer our assistance. But first, before anything else, we owe you the truth." Archivist Mirsha, watching from her seat in the archive section, leaned forward. Her ancient body protested the movement, but she ignored it. This was the moment she had waited 5 centuries to witness. The moment when the humans would explain why they had left and, more importantly, why they had returned. 500 years ago, Hannah continued, her words falling into the silence like stones into still water, humanity had spread across 40 star systems. We were powerful. We were aggressive. We were convinced of our own righteousness in everything we did. Every dispute was settled with force. Every disagreement became a war. We did not mean to be conquerors, but we were becoming exactly that. And some of us saw where that path was leading. Admiral Miho stepped forward, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that came from experience and hard-won wisdom. Our scientists had developed technology that made us virtually unstoppable. Our military could defeat any species we encountered. We won every battle. We claimed every system we wanted. And that terrified us. A murmur ran through the chamber. Terrified? The legendary humans had been afraid? Not because we feared defeat, Miho explained, but because we feared what we were becoming. We looked at ourselves and saw a species that had forgotten how to do anything except fight and conquer. We had forgotten how to build peace, how to show mercy, how to be anything except warriors. So we made a choice, Hannah said, and her voice carried centuries of weight. We quarantined ourselves. Every human, every ship, every colony. We withdrew beyond the galactic rim, into the space between galaxies where no one would follow. We left behind only probes and observers, watching but never interfering. And we worked on ourselves. 500 years, Miho continued. We spent that time advancing our technology, yes. That part is obvious to anyone who has seen our ships. But more importantly, we advanced our philosophy, our ethics, our understanding of what power truly means. We studied the mistakes of our past and the mistakes of every other species we had encountered. We learned, slowly and painfully, that the strongest warrior is one who knows when not to fight. Ambassador Krell could contain himself no longer. His voice cracked across the chamber like a whip, sharp with anger and wounded pride. Beautiful words. Poetry that sounds noble and wise. But you return with overwhelming force and expect us to simply accept your presence? You disabled our fleets without permission, without warning, without killing anyone, Hannah interrupted gently, but her voice cut through Krell's anger like a blade through water. Ambassador Krell, we detected your fleet movements 3 days before you reached Helios 7. We knew you were planning to use the civilian colony as leverage in your territorial dispute. Our ships were in position hours before the battle began. We could have destroyed your entire armada before it even left Vaxian space. We chose not to. The Vaxian home system of Draxia had always been a symbol of military might, but now it had become something more. It had become a fortress built not just for defense but for a statement. A declaration that some powers in the galaxy would not bow to newcomers, no matter how advanced their technology appeared to be. 3 massive orbital defense platforms circled the primary world, each one a marvel of engineering that had taken decades to construct. They were not merely defensive structures. Each platform carried weapons capable of cracking a planet's crust and boiling away its oceans. They had never been fired in actual combat, but their presence had been enough to deter aggression for generations. Beyond the platforms stretched defensive minefields that extended for millions of kilometers in every direction. Millions of autonomous weapons, each one programmed to identify and destroy anything that did not broadcast proper Vaxian identification codes. Ships attempting to navigate through these fields without authorization would be torn apart within minutes. But the most impressive sight was not the platforms or the minefields. It was the fleet that was converging on Draxia from every corner of Vaxian space and beyond. 12,000 warships. The number was almost incomprehensible. To see them all together was to witness a forest of metal and fire, a constellation of deadly intent. Dreadnoughts that could destroy moons. Carriers that held thousands of fighters. Cruisers, destroyers, frigates, and support vessels beyond counting. And this was not just the Vaxian military. 17 different species had answered Ambassador Krell's call, united under his banner of what he called galactic sovereignty. The message had been simple and had spread across every major world within days. The humans claimed to return as protectors, but who would protect the galaxy from them? They had demonstrated technology far beyond anything currently known. They had humiliated the Vaxian Empire. They spoke of peace while showing overwhelming force. This could not stand. This would not be tolerated. Either the Terrans would back down and leave or they would be destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of fighters swarmed between the larger ships like schools of predatory fish. Their pilots were veterans, warriors who had trained their entire lives for combat. Many species were represented among them, all united by a common purpose. They would show these legendary humans that the current galaxy was not weak, that it would not surrender its sovereignty to ghosts from the past. Aboard the superdreadnought Emperor's Will, Ambassador Krell stood on the command bridge and surveyed the assembled might with satisfaction that bordered on pride. This ship was the largest vessel ever constructed by the Vaxian Empire, a mobile fortress that served as both a command center and a symbol of imperial power. Around him, his command staff worked at their stations with practiced efficiency. These were the best officers the Empire could provide, chosen for their skill and loyalty. Display screens showed the tactical situation in real time, with thousands of blue markers representing friendly forces and a vast empty space where the enemy would soon appear. "Let the humans come," Krell announced, his voice carrying to every officer on the bridge. "Let them see what happens when they try to dictate terms to the greatest military power this galaxy has ever known. Let them learn that their tricks and their technology mean nothing against unified purpose and overwhelming numbers." His officers clicked their mandibles in approval, a gesture that rippled through the bridge like a wave. They believed in their ambassador. They believed in their empire. They believed that what had happened at Helios 7 had been a fluke, a surprise that would not be repeated now that everyone knew what the Terrans could do. The intentions had been declared publicly through every communication channel the galaxy possessed. The Terran fleet would be destroyed. Humanity would be driven back beyond the rim, back into the darkness from which it had emerged. Any species that supported the humans, any world that gave them aid or comfort, would face the same fate. This was not just a military operation. It was a message to the entire galaxy about who truly held power. The Galactic Council had begged both sides to negotiate. Dozens of neutral species had offered to mediate. Some of the smaller worlds had sent desperate pleas for peace, terrified of being caught in a conflict between forces they could not comprehend. But Krell had made his choice and he would not back down. To do so now would be to admit weakness. To admit that the Vaxian Empire could be intimidated. That was unacceptable. Admiral Miho had responded to the declaration with a message so brief that it had shocked many who heard it. Just a single sentence, transmitted in simple text across open channels where everyone could read it. "We accept your challenge. But we will not fire the first shot." Those words had been analyzed by military strategists across the galaxy. Some thought it was a sign of weakness. Others suspected it was a psychological tactic. A few worried that it meant the humans were so confident in their superiority that they could afford to grant the first move to their enemies. Krell chose to interpret it as hesitation. The humans, for all their advanced technology, were afraid of starting a war. They were bluffing, using impressive displays to avoid actual combat. Well, they would soon learn that the Vaxian Empire did not respond well to bluffs. Now, on the edge of the Draxia system, space itself seemed to tear open like fabric being cut by invisible scissors. The Terran fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel in perfect formation, their dark ships materializing against the stars with that same unnerving grace they had shown at Helios 7. Every sensor in the Vaxian fleet locked onto them, counting and analyzing. The numbers came back quickly, spreading through the command network and appearing on tactical displays throughout the armada. 300 ships. The same number that had appeared at Helios 7. Against 12,000. For a moment, there was stunned silence across multiple command bridges. Then someone started laughing. The sound was picked up by others, spreading through communication channels. 300 against 12,000? Had the humans gone insane? This was not a battle. This was going to be a massacre. Krell stared at the display, hardly daring to believe what he was seeing. Part of him had expected the humans to arrive with thousands of ships, with technology so advanced that numbers would not matter. But this? This was either supreme arrogance or supreme stupidity. They are either insane or suicidal, he said aloud, and his command staff clicked their agreement. All ships, advance formation. Close to weapons range. Show them what real power looks like. The Vaxian armada began to move forward, and it was like watching a metal tide sweep across the cosmos. 12,000 ships advancing in coordinated formation was a sight that no one present would ever forget. The fighters launched first, swarming ahead of the main fleet in clouds that numbered in the hundreds of thousands. They moved like a living thing, a single organism with deadly purpose. Behind them came the capital ships, their weapons charging to full power. Energy readings spiked across the electromagnetic spectrum as plasma cannons, particle beams, missile batteries and kinetic accelerators all prepared to fire. Every weapon system in the entire armada was coming online simultaneously, creating an energy signature so massive that it would be visible to sensors halfway across the galaxy. It was glorious. It was terrible. It was overwhelming in its sheer scale and fury. The Terran ships did not move. They held their formation at the edge of the system, 300 dark vessels against the approaching storm of steel and fire. They made no aggressive maneuvers. They did not charge their weapons or raise their shields. They simply waited, as still as stones in a river while the current rushed toward them. Fire when in range. Krell commanded, his voice sharp with anticipation. Show them the price of arrogance. The first wave of missiles launched from the advancing fleet. 10,000 weapons, each one capable of cracking a moon open like an egg. They streaked toward the Terran line like a river of light, their engines burning bright against the darkness. It was beautiful in its own terrible way, a display of destructive power that represented centuries of military advancement. And then the missiles simply vanished. Not exploded. Not intercepted. They just ceased to exist as if they had never been fired at all. 6 months had passed since the day that would forever be remembered in galactic history as the Draxia lesson. The name itself carried weight, speaking not of a battle won through destruction, but of something far more profound. A lesson taught not through violence but through restraint. Through the terrible mercy of warriors who could have destroyed everything and chose instead to protect. The Galactic Council chamber looked different now, and the changes went far deeper than simple decoration. The old seating arrangement, with its hierarchical tiers that placed some species physically above others, had been dismantled. In its place, circular seating had been installed, where every delegate sat at the same level, able to see every other delegate as an equal. It was a small change in terms of physical construction, but it was symbolic of something much larger happening across the galaxy. A shift in understanding about what power truly meant and how it should be used. Ambassador Krell stood at what was now called the Vaxian position rather than the Vaxian throne section. He looked different from the proud, aggressive figure who had stood in this chamber 6 months ago declaring that humanity would be driven from the galaxy. The physical changes were subtle. Perhaps his exoskeleton had lost some of its luster, making him appear older. Perhaps his posture carried less aggressive certainty and more thoughtful consideration. Or perhaps it was not his body that had changed but something deeper. Something in his eyes that spoke of someone who had seen the world differently and could never return to his old way of seeing. He had spent the past 6 months doing something that no Vaxian ambassador had done in living memory. He had traveled to human settlements throughout the territory humanity had established since their return. He had observed their society, their decision-making processes, their technological integration with other species. He had attended their universities and listened to their philosophers. He had sat in their military academies and learned how they trained warriors to know when not to fight. And most difficult of all for a proud Vaxian who had spent his entire career believing in the supremacy of his empire, he had admitted that he had been wrong. Now he stood before the council, and when he spoke, his voice was steady, but everyone present could hear the emotion beneath the words. It was the sound of someone speaking a truth that had cost them everything they once believed, but that had given them something more valuable in return. The Vaxian Empire formally requests membership in the Terran Alliance, he announced, and those words seemed to echo in the silence that followed. We ask to be taught what humanity learned in their 500 years beyond the rim. We ask to be shown how power can be used for protection rather than conquest. We want to become better than we were. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of witnesses processing something they had never expected to see. The Vaxian Empire, undefeated in conventional warfare for over a century, asking to be taught by the species they had tried to destroy. It was a moment that would be recorded in history texts for thousands of years to come. But Krell was not finished. He continued, and his voice carried the weight of genuine transformation. We understand that trust must be earned, not demanded. We understand that words alone mean nothing after our actions at Draxia. We are prepared to prove our sincerity through our deeds, for as long as it takes for you to believe us. Ambassador Hannah, standing in the human delegation section, inclined her head in acknowledgement. There was no triumph in her expression. No satisfaction at seeing a former enemy humbled. Only respect for the courage it took to make such a statement. And Krell was far from alone in his request. 17 species had already joined the Terran Alliance in the months since Draxia. Some were small species who had always lived under the shadow of larger military powers and saw in humanity a chance for genuine protection. Others were mid-sized civilizations who recognized that the old ways of solving disputes through military force had reached a dead end. A few were even large, powerful species who had looked at what happened at Draxia and understood the deeper lesson being taught. 30 more species had sent delegations to negotiate membership. They filled the halls outside the council chamber, each one sending their diplomats to discuss terms, ask questions, and understand what membership in the alliance would mean for their people. The galaxy was transforming, and the most remarkable thing about this transformation was that it was happening through choice, not conquest. Nobody was being forced to join. Nobody was being threatened with destruction if they refused. The alliance offered technology sharing, educational exchanges, mutual defense agreements, and philosophical guidance. But it demanded something in return that many species found more challenging than any military tribute. It demanded that its members commit to protecting innocent life, even when it was inconvenient. Even when it conflicted with national interests. Even when it meant standing against former allies who refused to change. But not everyone was happy about these developments. 12 species had formally rejected any contact with humanity or the Terran Alliance. They had retreated into isolation, closing their borders and refusing all diplomatic communications. Some were genuinely afraid, believing that human influence would destroy their traditional cultures. Others were proud civilizations that could not bear the thought of accepting guidance from any outside force, no matter how benevolent it claimed to be. A few were species whose power structures depended on military intimidation, and they recognized that the new order humanity represented would undermine everything they had built. The Krenth Dominion had been particularly vocal in their opposition. Their representative had sent a message that was broadcast across every major communication network in the galaxy, ensuring that everyone heard their position. You call it wisdom, the message stated, delivered in the harsh, clicking language of the Krenth and translated into hundreds of tongues. We call it manipulation. Today the humans are benevolent. Today they use their power to protect rather than conquer. But power corrupts all beings regardless of species or intention. Give it time, and the humans will become the very thing they claim to have left behind. They will become tyrants, and by then, it will be too late for the galaxy to resist them. The message had caused considerable debate. Many species found themselves torn between hope and fear, between the promise of what humanity offered and the historical precedent that suggested all great powers eventually became corrupt. Admiral Miho had chosen to respond personally, and his response had been broadcast just as widely as the Krenth message. He stood before recording devices in a simple human dwelling, wearing civilian clothes rather than his military uniform, and spoke with the kind of honesty that made even skeptics pause. The Krenth may be right, he said simply, and those 4 words shocked everyone who heard them. A leader admitting that his critics might have valid points? Power does corrupt. We saw it corrupting us 500 years ago, which is exactly why we left. We could feel it changing us, making us more aggressive, more certain of our righteousness, more willing to use force to solve every problem. And that terrified us enough to take drastic action. He paused, and the recording captured the weariness in his eyes. The weight of commanding a fleet that could reshape the galaxy but chose not to. That is why we have built something into the very foundation of the Terran Alliance. Something we call the Compact. It is programmed into every ship we have constructed, every artificial intelligence system we have created, every piece of advanced technology we have shared with our allies. If humanity or any member of the Alliance uses their power to conquer rather than protect, to dominate rather than defend, to rule rather than serve, the technology will shut down. Permanently. Irreversibly. We cannot override it. We cannot disable it. We have built our own leash, and we have made sure that leash cannot be removed. The implications of this statement rippled across the galaxy like waves from a stone thrown into still water. The humans had not just limited their own power. They had built in a mechanism that would render them helpless if they violated their own principles. It was either the most profound commitment to ethical behavior any species had ever made, or it was the most elaborate deception in galactic history. Ambassador Hannah had followed up on Admiral Miho's message with her own statement, addressing the Council directly. We do not ask for blind trust. We ask only for the opportunity to prove ourselves through our actions. Watch us. Question us. Hold us accountable. If we fail to live up to our principles, then expose that failure to the entire galaxy. We have given you the tools to check our power. We ask you to use them. Ambassador Krell, inspired by the human example, had announced that the Vaxian Empire would implement its own version of this system. They called it the Oath of Draxia, named after the place where they had learned the hard lesson about the limits of military might.